Have you ever disappeared from the human world for 2 years and then returned with no memory of why? In the fall of 1993, Daniel Weiss, 28 years old, returned to the remote Klamath Mountains of Northern California. To the townsfolk, he was just another biologist, here to study insects. But deep inside, he carried a secret. When he was 6 years old, he disappeared for 2 whole years. And during those 2 years, he was raised, not by humans, but by something with a face like ours. Now he wasn't here to hunt, not to prove. He came to say thank you. The forest had changed, but the hum remained. A lullaby not heard with ears, but with the ribs, with memory, with the bones. And in the valley, he met Lydia Mooney, a mute woman whose eyes seemed to see through the forest's darkness. They didn't need words. She too had loved and lost a child. They understood each other. For 8 years, Daniel had tracked the low lullaby across the Klamath. Now the points on his map aligned, forming an ancient corridor. And he began to leave offerings, berries, drawings, a worn scarf, not to bait, but to honor. Each morning they were moved. Someone, something, was listening. But danger came, not from the forest, from men. 3 hunters, armed and righteous, set traps. Daniel had to choose evidence or life. He chose love. He burned his deepest notes, misled the hunters with rhythmic knocks, mimicking the lullaby. That night, when silence returned to the trees, Daniel knelt, placed his father's old lighter in the earth, and whispered, "Thank you." By morning, the lighter was gone. In its place, a woven figure made of reed and fur. 3 silhouettes standing together. Some things aren't meant to be proven. Some are meant to be protected. And sometimes, kindness is stronger than instinct. Sometimes, silence is love. Where are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments, because this story deserves to echo beyond the woods. If you believe there are mysteries worth honoring, and voices in the wild worth listening to, tap like, subscribe, and help us build a community where Bigfoot isn't hunted, but remembered. Lovingly, quietly, together. Autumn swept through the Klamath like a held breath slowly let go. Golden needles gathering in silence along the trails, air crisp and still, as if the whole forest were waiting for something to return. The rustle of Daniel Weiss's boots broke that hush as he crossed the timberline alone. A weathered canvas pack bouncing against his back, the legs of an old tripod sticking out like forgotten bones. He moved without hurry, without noise, the way someone moves when they know the woods might be listening. He hadn't told the truth to the folks in the ranger station down in Eureka. Said he was doing research, mapping infestation patterns, maybe tracking bark beetles. Showed them a laminated badge from UC Berkeley and a few field notes no one cared to double-check. They nodded and waved him through. Just another quiet man going to study something quiet in a place that preferred things that way. But what Daniel carried wasn't for science, and what he was chasing didn't live in textbooks or charts. He hiked until the light faded into that kind of blue you only see in October. Just before full dark, he found a bend in the river that felt familiar, not in the way a place you visited does, but like something you once dreamed of and then forgot. He pitched a small, battered tent under a red fir leaning slightly east, unrolled his bedroll beside the sound of slow water, and laid his notebook across his knees like an offering. It was nearly silent, not just quiet, silent. So silent he could hear sap shifting inside the trees. And then it came. Not a sound. Not exactly. More like a pressure. A low thrum in the chest. Too deep to be heard. Too soft to be wind. It rolled out of the woods like the bottom note of a lullaby, and it hit him not in the ears but behind the ribs, where memory waits. He sat still, blinking into the dark, eyes wide, skin prickling. The sensation was unmistakable. Not like it, not close to it. It was the same. the exact same. When Daniel was 6 years old, he'd gone missing in Olympic National Park for nearly 2 days. They found him crouched in the roots of a cedar, calm, unscathed, and humming a tune no one had taught him. His parents said it was shock. The rescue workers said he must have heard some wildlife or distant highway. But Daniel remembered. Not a tune, not a song. A sound, a voice without words. Something vast and old that didn't speak but somehow soothed. A low vibration that meant, "You're not alone." He hadn't heard it since. Until now. He slept without dreams, mouth parted, hands tucked beneath his head. And when he woke just before dawn, the air was so cold it cracked inside his nose. Dew shimmered like frost on the fly of his tent. He pushed open the flap and froze. It was standing just outside the circle of his campfire stones. Not a creature, not a person. A thing made from reeds, twisted and woven, soaked and dried. 3 figures, side by side, touching at the shoulders. No faces, no features, just shapes. Humanoid, stiff, unmoving, bound together at the arms like a single unit with 3 heads. The light caught on the wet sheen of the silt that coated its legs. Daniel stepped closer and saw the dark streak of river mud still clinging to the bottom of the thing. He crouched, heart climbing into his throat, and reached a hand out but stopped before touching it. There was no mistake. This wasn't random. Someone or something had made this, carried it, placed it. A message? A warning? No, it felt like neither. It felt like a memory. Like something made by hands that remembered his hands. Like an answer to a question he hadn't asked out loud. Daniel stared at it for a long time. The morning wind stirring his hair, the river murmuring behind him, and the breath inside his chest coming slow and full and scared in the way that wonder always is. He stood and looked deeper into the forest. Something was calling, not in a loud voice, not in panic, but in the way a mother might call a child from across a yard as the sky grows dark. Just once, softly, trusting they'll come. He packed slowly, folded his tent, brushed off his boots, checked his pencil and pages, and tucked the reed effigy into a side pouch of his bag. Not to keep, not to claim, just to carry for a while. Like it had carried him. By noon he was walking upstream, the sun glinting through pine needles, his breath warming the air in front of him. The woods weren't loud, but they weren't silent anymore either. Small things moved through the brush. Birds dipped low over the water, and now and then a distant woodpecker sent a knocking rhythm through the trunks that didn't quite match the bird's usual beat. Daniel paused more than once to jot a mark on the topographic map tucked into his notebook. The same patterns were appearing. Same locations as before. Same feel in the air. Same stories he'd gathered from over 50 people across 3 states, all describing the same thing in different words. A low hum, a calming echo. A lullaby that made them cry without knowing why. Now it wasn't rumor. It was here. He knew this wasn't science. It wasn't hallucination either. It was real in the same way grief is real. Something that can't be measured but pulls the body all the same. That night, he didn't light a fire. The wind turned colder. He curled into his sleeping bag in full clothes, watched the moon rise like a white coin between the trees, and listened. Not just with ears, with skin, with breath, with memory. And again it came, faint but steady. That hum, that thrum, that roo. It vibrated up from the ground, through the tent floor, into his spine. He didn't cry, but his throat burned, his hands trembled, his body knew it before his mind could name it. You've been here before. You belong to this. He drifted into sleep with his notebook tucked against his chest, pages fluttering faintly with the night wind like wings. And in the gray space before morning, before thought returned, before logic kicked in, he saw something behind his eyelids. Not a dream, not a vision, just a shape. 3 shadows, side by side, holding hands, the same as the reed effigy. The same as the drawing he made when he was 6 and hid inside a hollow log from the world. 3 shadows standing not in warning, not in fear, but in waiting. Waiting for him to come deeper, to stop chasing proof, to remember instead. He woke with a start. The sun hadn't yet climbed. A layer of fog hovered low over the river, and something inside him had shifted. Not broken, not awakened, just opened. The forest wasn't just forest anymore. It was a memory that had waited for him to return. And now it had started speaking again, but not with words. With that same old lullaby, that same soft pull beneath the ribs. A call without sound. He rolled up his sleeping bag and didn't touch the pencil that morning. He didn't write. He didn't need to. The page was in his chest now. He just walked, deeper, farther, where the trail gave up and the moss got thicker and the ferns brushed his knees like prayer beads. He didn't know what he'd find next, but the forest did, and it had already begun. He followed the stream, narrow and fast. It carved its way down from the ridgelines like a secret, slapping against polished stones, curling around the trunks of red alders that leaned in as if whispering something between themselves. Daniel moved alongside it without speaking, without thinking too hard, his boots wet from the morning frost. The notebook pressed against his ribs like a heartbeat. The air carried that strange sweetness that only early fall in the Pacific Northwest could hold. Part damp wood, part decaying leaf, part moss gone soft in shadow. He didn't know where he was heading exactly, only that he had to keep going. The trail wasn't marked. It barely existed at all, just a suggestion of passage through the thicket where deer or something older had once moved. His body leaned slightly forward now, like it remembered something he didn't. Branches licked his coat. Twigs snapped underfoot. The forest didn't seem hostile, but it watched, not with suspicion, more like curiosity. The way you might watch a stray dog slowly circle your porch. Then he saw it. Not a house, not even a proper cabin. Just a squat timber structure, almost absorbed by ferns and vines, buried behind a fallen cedar, like the forest had tried to reclaim it, and someone stubborn kept pushing back. Smoke curled faintly from a rusted stovepipe punched through the sagging roof. The windows were covered in grime, the panes catching the light like eyes filmed over with age. A deer skull hung from a nail beside the door. Wind chimes made of bones clinked in the breeze. Quiet, hollow, irregular. He stepped closer, heart low in his chest. He hadn't expected this, but something in him had. Something had known. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there. Late 60s, maybe older. Skin like river stone, tough and weathered but still holding warmth. Her hair was tied back in a braid streaked with silver and soot. She didn't speak, just looked at him. The kind of look that doesn't ask who you are because it already knows something about you that words would ruin. Daniel shifted his weight. I didn't mean to trespass. She turned without a word and stepped back inside. Something in the way she moved told him it wasn't a dismissal. It was an invitation. He followed. Inside, it smelled like sage and damp soil, pine resin, iron. The hearth was small, stacked with alderwood barely smoldering. Dozens of small items lined every shelf. Stones, feathers, bits of broken glass, knotted twine, folded paper dark with age. A child's rain boot filled with dried herbs sat beside a cracked photo frame face down. The floor creaked under his step, but the woman didn't flinch. She walked to the far corner and lifted a tin kettle from the stove, poured water into a clay mug, and handed it to him without looking. He took it with both hands. Warm, earthy. Something bitter floated inside. Cedar, maybe, or old nettle. Still, she hadn't said a word. He cleared his throat. I'm not just here for insects. That's what I told the station, but I'm not a threat. The woman met his eyes then. Her gaze didn't soften. It deepened, like looking into a lake and realizing there's no bottom. She turned and walked to a far shelf, lifted a piece of hide from a hook, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then she nodded toward the door. Daniel set the mug down gently and followed her out, boots sinking slightly into the loam. She moved with ease, not fast, but with a kind of surety that came from never being lost, only alone. They walked downhill, deeper into the canopy, where the light turned green and the shadows hung low like forgotten lullabies. She didn't speak, didn't glance back, just moved. And he followed. After 20 minutes, they came to a clearing. Not empty, cleared. At the center stood a boulder, the size of a car, flat on top, its surface stained with moss and the black streaks of rain. But it wasn't just stone. It had markings, carvings, not deep, not fresh, but ancient. Grooves spiraled across its face in slow curves, intersecting with odd symbols, some looking like bent arrows, others like eyes without pupils or spines of fish. It didn't look like language. It looked like memory, etched not to be read, but remembered. The woman stepped up to it and placed her hand on the stone. Daniel moved closer, breath slow. The air around the boulder felt heavier, like standing inside the echo of a thunderclap. She traced one of the lines with her finger, not to show him, just to feel. He noticed her hand then, rough, scarred, marked with small burns and an old tattoo faded to blue. She pressed her palm to the center of the stone, and for a moment, didn't move. The wind shifted slightly, brushing her braid against her back. Her eyes closed. When she turned toward him, her face had changed, not in shape, but in depth. The grief was no longer hidden. It stood at the surface now, raw and plain, like a wound long scabbed over that's been picked open again. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into the side pocket of her woven coat and pulled out a small clay vessel, handmade, darkened by time. She held it gently, like a bird, and set it down on the edge of the stone. Then it slipped. It hit the rock, cracked, then shattered. She gasped, just once. Daniel stepped forward, but froze as she dropped to her knees, cradling a shard in both palms like it was a piece of herself. Her shoulders hunched. Her fingers curled inward, pulling the clay against her chest. No sound came from her mouth, but her eyes filled, and he looked away. Not out of pity, but respect. And then he saw the scar. It ran across her lower abdomen, jagged, pale against her skin where her shirt had pulled loose. A surgical scar. The kind made in hospitals, not wilderness. It looked old. Something inside him clicked into place. This woman had borne a child, and lost them. Not just once, over and over, every day since. He knelt beside her, but didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Instead, he let the silence speak. Let the air between them hold the weight. Let the forest bear witness. After a while, she stood. Slow, deliberate, clay shard still in hand. She didn't meet his eyes again. Just walked back the way they came, as if nothing had happened. As if she had not let him see the part of her that still bled. But she had, and he knew it. They didn't speak as they returned to the cabin. Inside, she set the shard on the shelf next to the face-down photo frame and turned it over. A young boy, maybe 5. Hair wild, eyes soft. The corner of the photo torn. But the shape of his hand was visible, reaching out toward someone not in the frame. Daniel's throat closed. She sat by the fire, stared into the embers. He sat beside her, notebook untouched. Outside, the wind picked up again, and for the first time, Daniel understood something about silence. That it wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of memory, held without breaking, carried without explanation. He didn't sleep that night. He watched the flames flicker against the walls and thought about the markings on the stone. The way her hand trembled. The look in her eyes that said, "We were here long before they wrote your maps." Somewhere deep in the trees, an owl called out once, then went quiet. Daniel didn't answer. He just listened, because some things are not meant to be explained, only remembered. Under the weight of the dusk sky, Daniel sat cross-legged inside his tent, head bowed over the pages of a thick, hand-bound notebook wrapped in cloth so worn It looked like it belonged to another decade. Outside, the forest was breathing in that slow, careful rhythm it used after sundown. Branches brushing together in whispers, river carrying old stories past sleeping stones. Inside the thin nylon walls, the light from his headlamp gave everything a dull amber glow, flickering slightly with the breeze that leaked in through the zipper seam. He flipped to the beginning, hands steady but not relaxed, as if the act of returning to the first page meant stepping back into a skin he hadn't worn in years. The ink was faded in places, smeared in others from rain, sweat, maybe tears. He'd started the journal 8 years ago, shortly after college, long before he had any real reason to believe the memory from his childhood wasn't just the invention of a scared, lost boy. But page after page, trip after trip, story after story. All those nights parked in small-town diners or hitchhiking to ranger posts, following rumors like breadcrumbs, something inside him had kept pressing forward. And now, sitting by the Klamath River, with the sound of that low thrum still embedded in his bones, it all felt like more than just coincidence. It felt like gravity. The map folded between the back pages was creased to the point of near collapse. He opened it carefully, smoothing the corners, tracing his finger along the line that curved down from British Columbia, through Washington, Oregon, and into Northern California. Small dots, some penciled in, others circled in red, followed that invisible corridor, each one marking a place where someone had whispered about the sound. Locals in tiny towns with names you don't see on most maps. Hunters who'd sworn the forest had once gone still and sung to them. A fisherman in Forks who'd wept when Daniel played back a low-frequency hum recorded off an old VHS tape. A little girl in Weed, California, who stopped mid-sentence one morning, turned toward the trees and said, "Mama's voice is there." None of them had used the same words. Some didn't even speak it aloud. But every story pointed to the same thing, a lullaby with no source. A note held not in air but in earth. It traveled, not randomly, but along something older than any highway, older than any trail. It followed the retreat of the animals, the movements of the seasons. Not where people built fences and put up trail cameras, but where the land remembered. Daniel flipped back to the drawing. It was taped onto the inside of the notebook's cover, slightly crooked. He'd made it when he was 6, not long after they found him in the Olympic backcountry. Crayons on construction paper, childish lines, mud-stained edges. 3 figures standing side by side, holding hands. No faces, just shapes. And beneath them, scribbled in block letters, the word home. He ran his fingers across the page slowly. When they'd pulled him out of the cedar hollow all those years ago, he hadn't cried. Not until they asked what he'd seen. Then the tears came like a broken pipe. Not out of fear, out of loss, because something had been taken away the second they lifted him back into the arms of the world. Something he hadn't been able to name until now. He looked down at the mud smeared into the bottom of the drawing. All this time, he thought it was just dirt from when he dropped it in the yard. But now it looked like the same mineral silt he'd seen earlier that week along the Klamath. Same dark brown hue with flecks of red clay and glints of mica. He rubbed a thumb across the paper and felt the grit crumble beneath his nail. It wasn't just similar, it was the same. This wasn't chance. He stared at the crude drawing again. Then back at the folded map. Then at the reed figure he'd carried with him from the riverbank, now propped up beside his bedroll like a totem. And suddenly the entire pattern pulled tight like a thread being yanked from under the skin. The stories, the drawings, the tone, the locations, the forest, the hum. It wasn't scattered. It was deliberate. These weren't coincidences. They were coordinates. And somehow, some way, he'd come back to the very place where that memory had been seated inside him decades ago. It wasn't a memory, he realized. It was a message. Left inside his bones, left for this exact moment. The forest hadn't sung to everyone, only to a few, and only when they were still enough to hear it. He closed the notebook gently and pressed it to his chest. The fire outside had long gone cold, but the air inside the tent held warmth. Not from heat, but from presence. Something beyond the nylon walls was awake. Not watching, not hunting, just aware. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. He turned off the lamp and let darkness settle around him. The reeds outside rustled softly. A twig snapped far off. The river kept talking in its slow, watery way. And again, like a chord struck in the marrow, he felt it. Not loud, not sudden, but deep. That same low vibration. The same one he remembered from the cedar hollow as a child. The one that had silenced the fear in his chest and filled it with something like sleep. Not a tune, not even a hum. Just a presence in pitch. A kindness you could feel but never explain. He didn't write anything else that night. He didn't need to. The story wasn't on the pages anymore. It was in the forest, in the rock Lydia had touched, in the smoke that drifted over her roof, in the reed figure that mirrored his own childhood scribbles. It was stitched through the land like a seam, holding something old in place beneath everything people tried to build over it. He rolled onto his back, eyes open, watching the faint shape of the tent's roof shiver with the breeze. His heartbeat settled into the same rhythm as the sound outside, not matching it, but answering it, like a harmony beneath a lead. His hands relaxed. He slept with the notebook still pressed to his chest, breath rising slowly, sinking with the earth below. And far off, in some deeper stretch of the woods, something listened back. When morning came, it was soft and slow. The sun didn't break, just crept in, pale and golden through the damp mesh of pine and fog. Daniel sat up, sore but clear, and unzipped the tent flap in one motion. The air smelled like memory. Not nostalgia, memory, real, present, still alive. He stepped outside and stretched, shaking the night from his limbs. Then he pulled the map from the notebook again and made a new mark. Here, where the vibration had returned, where the line curved not around a landmark, but through him. It wasn't the end of the trail. It wasn't even the middle. It was just the place where he stopped looking for proof and started listening for presence. The kind of listening that doesn't need answers, just silence. And when he looked down again at the reed figure, its legs dusted in fresh morning dew, he noticed something different. A small notch had been carved into the middle figure's chest. 3 short lines, vertically stacked. He didn't know what they meant, but he knew who they were meant for, and he knew they were waiting, just a little further in. Under a canopy thick with autumn rot and filtered gold light, Daniel moved without sound, following the pull of something older than instinct. The deeper he went, the narrower the path became, until it was no longer a path at all, just a memory of movement beneath a cradle of moss and ancient pine. He didn't speak, didn't write. He barely breathed above the hush of his boots brushing through wet ferns. The forest had grown denser since morning, swallowing even the wind, leaving behind only the rhythmic drip of water from branch tips and the low shuffle of needles underfoot. Every step he took felt watched, but not by eyes. More like by the land itself. He passed between 2 cedar trunks that arched like the worn ribs of something long dead. Beyond them, the ground dipped into a narrow gorge where the light shifted cooler and the air grew damp. The scent changed, too. Earthy still, but with something sharper riding beneath it, like iron left out in the rain. He paused, sniffed, let the weight of it settle in his throat. Blood, maybe, but faint, faded. It made his skin tighten along his arms. He crouched low, eyes scanning the ground. The brush was flattened, not torn. No claw marks, no signs of violence. Just a trail, thin and strange, like something heavy had been dragged through carefully, deliberately, almost gently. Leaves crushed inward, dirt turned in soft scallops, But no breaks, no splinters, no frenzy. It looked respectful or afraid. He followed it. The trail wound between thick ferns and smooth stone walls, curving down into a quiet hollow shaded by the overhang of blackened rock. Sunlight barely touched the floor here, and when it did, it shimmered in broken ribbons across the damp earth. Daniel kept low, one hand grazing the stone for balance, his other wrapped around the strap of his pack. He moved slow, listening with his entire body, until the trail ended in silence. And there, nestled in a bowl of moss and fog, was something breathing. Large, motionless, but breathing. It was curled, spine arched, limbs tucked in, a shape too big for any known animal in this region. The fur was dark and matted with moisture, tangled in places where dried blood had crusted into the strands. Not fresh, but not long dead either. The rise and fall of its chest was slow, shallow, and strained. Daniel's eyes widened as he leaned forward, not daring to move closer. The creature wasn't a bear. The body was longer, the shoulders more human in slope, the legs bent not like paws but knees. He couldn't see the face yet, only the slope of its back and the long reach of one arm curled tight against its side. He felt a tremor move through the soles of his boots. Not an earthquake, not danger, just a shift, like the forest itself had inhaled and was now holding its breath. Then the creature moved, just its head, slow and painful, turning fractionally to the side. One eye opened, amber. Not animal, not wild. It didn't blink, didn't snarl or flinch. It looked at him the way someone in pain might look toward the sound of distant music, distant comfort. That single eye, glossy with fever and fatigue, met his and held it, not with threat, but with resignation, as if it understood exactly what he was, as if it had already accepted whatever would come next. And Daniel couldn't move. His heart thudded loud enough to drown out thought, his mouth dry, his body poised between awe and something close to grief. The creature didn't look afraid. It looked tired. It looked like it had been running, hiding, carrying something too heavy for too long, like it was done. Then came the soft rustle behind him. Daniel didn't turn. He didn't need to. Lydia's presence moved in like fog, silent and certain. Her footsteps barely touched the ground. She came to stand beside him without a word, her arm brushing his coat. He turned his head slowly and saw her face. Eyes locked on the creature, mouth drawn tight, jaw trembling in a way she couldn't hide. Her hands, strong and weathered, reached out not toward the beast, but toward him. She took his hand, squeezed it tight. The message was clear. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not interfere. This moment wasn't his. He looked back toward the creature. It hadn't moved again. Still watching. Still breathing in those shallow, fragile bursts. He saw now the wound beneath the fur. Deep gashes along the side of its ribs, half healed but infected. There were no claw marks, no signs of battle. It was the kind of damage you only got from something made of metal. Blades, maybe. Traps. But again, it wasn't fresh. Someone had tried to hide it, or heal it. It was failing. Lydia stepped forward slightly. Just one step. She didn't speak. She only closed her eyes and pressed both hands together at her chest like in prayer. Then she bent at the waist and bowed her head. Not toward Daniel, not toward the creature, but toward the space between them. The silence that held them both. Daniel watched her, his pulse starting to slow. Her body spoke in place of words. Reverence, not pity, not worship. Just knowing. Then she straightened and met his gaze with eyes that weren't just old. They were ancient, lined with something deeper than sorrow, something that had stopped needing to be explained. She glanced once more at the creature, then back at him. Her lips parted slightly, and in that moment, he expected her to finally speak. She didn't. She only shook her head, once slow, with finality. And in her silence, He heard everything. This is not for you to touch. This is not yours to save. This is not your story to fix. You are only here to witness. Then she turned and walked away. Daniel stayed. He crouched there a little longer, the forest humming low and thick around him, the creature's breath rasping in and out like the tide. He didn't reach for his notebook. He didn't raise his camera. He just looked. And for the first time since stepping into these woods, he truly understood what it meant to be quiet. Not silent, quiet. He let the moment stretch, not measuring it in seconds or thoughts, but in the slow exhale of something sacred that didn't need to be recorded, only remembered. Eventually he stood and backed away, step by step, never turning his back, never breaking eye contact, until the gorge curved again and the creature vanished from view. He didn't speak for the rest of the day, didn't eat, didn't write. He sat by his cold fire circle that night and watched the stars blink in and out behind the cloud bank, the air sharp in his lungs. He could still feel Lydia's grip in his palm, still feel that amber eye in the dark. And for the first time, he wondered if all his maps, all his notes, all his careful listening and tracing and chasing, if maybe that had only ever brought him to the edge, because the center wasn't his to enter, only to circle, only to feel, only to carry in silence, like a sacred bruise you don't dare explain. And somewhere, deeper in the forest, a breath went still. Under a sky veiled in thin cloud and pine shadow, Daniel stepped barefoot onto the cold morning soil. He'd left his boots by the fire pit, stripped down to the base layers of his clothes, and stood now at the edge of a clearing that felt more like a cathedral than a patch of earth. The light was faint, filtered through cedar boughs, windless, still, a stillness that wasn't emptiness but invitation. Around him, the forest held its breath again, not in suspense, but in ritual. And Daniel, whether he fully knew it or not, was about to answer something that had been calling long before he could speak. He'd spent the last 2 days alone, without fire, without words, retracing the edges of where he'd seen the wounded creature. He hadn't gone back to the gorge. Lydia hadn't returned either. Some part of him understood now. Some silences must be left untouched, and some moments were not meant to be chased. But still, he couldn't leave nothing behind. Not after what he'd seen. Not after the eye that looked into him like it had been waiting. He couldn't offer healing, not in the way the world taught him. But maybe something older, something closer to what the forest understood. Gesture, pattern, presence. So he began. On the first day, he found a patch of red berries not far from a split-trunk yew. They were the kind that burst bright and bitter between the teeth. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered them, not from cold, but from the weight of meaning. He didn't pile them, just laid them gently at the base of the tree, one by one, fingers moving slow, a red mark on a green floor. Nothing spoken, just intention. He stepped back and let the space hold it. A gift, a message with no demand. A small way to say, I'm still here, and I remember. That night, the wind returned, faint but deliberate, and with it came the thrum again, fainter than before, but steady, moving through the tree trunks like a tide under the bark. Daniel lay in his sleeping bag with his eyes wide open, staring up through mesh and moonlight. He didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because he didn't want to miss any part of it. It was no longer about collecting proof. It had never really been about that. He just didn't want to forget what it felt like when the forest breathed back. On the second day, he dug into the bottom of his pack until he found it. An old wool scarf, dark green, the weave patchy in places, worn nearly to thread. It was from when he was a boy. His mother had tucked it around his neck the winter he disappeared. He hadn't worn it in years. He didn't even know why he packed it. Maybe part of him had always known this wasn't going to be a normal trip, that this wasn't about beetles or notes, that it was about something broken inside of him still looking for the note that had held him together all those years ago. He walked until he found a stone, Not the same kind as the carved boulder, but smooth, flat, and warm in the sunlight. He knelt beside it and folded the scarf neatly, almost reverently, like he remembered his father folding the flag at a funeral once. He laid it on the rock and didn't move for a long time. He didn't cry, but his jaw clenched, his hands shook. The grief wasn't sharp. It was low, steady, like a song too deep for sound. He whispered, though he didn't know to what or whom, "I didn't forget. I didn't turn away." The forest answered with nothing, but it didn't feel empty, just full of listening. On the third day, he took the drawing, the one he'd carried since childhood, the one with the 3 figures, hand in hand. He hadn't meant to use it. He thought maybe he'd keep it forever. But something inside him had shifted since the gorge, since Lydia's hand, since the amber eye. Holding on to things didn't feel the same anymore. Giving did. He pressed the drawing flat and found a single leaf, broad and copper-colored, fallen from the high maple up the ridge, and laid it gently over the center of the page, then pressed both between 2 thin, pale branches. A kind of frame, a kind of offering. The picture was clumsy, childish, smeared with age, but it meant more than anything else he owned. Not because it was accurate, but because it was true. He placed it at the foot of the same cedar where he'd left the berries. A pattern forming, a rhythm. He stepped back, hands loose at his sides, and waited. That night the forest grew still again, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. Daniel didn't light a fire. He didn't eat. Just sat in the dark, hands in his lap, breath even. He didn't expect an answer, but he was beginning to understand that answers came in ways you didn't expect. And when morning came, something had changed. The picture was gone. Not scattered, not blown away, gone. In its place, the scarf still rested on the stone. But now, atop it, sat a single object. A stone. Round, small, dark gray. Ordinary in any other context. But here, placed with care, weighted just enough to hold the memory of someone else's hand, it was unmistakable. A response. Daniel's breath caught. He didn't move at first. Didn't touch it. Just looked. A stone, placed on a scarf. Not human, not wild, but something between. A gesture, not a word, not a symbol, just recognition. A way of saying, "I heard you." He sat down beside it and let himself feel the weight of it. Not just the object, but the truth behind it. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a projection of his past or a hope written into the trees. It was real. He was not alone in his remembering. The forest remembered too, and someone else had been watching. He looked up at the trees. The wind was back. Not strong. Just enough to move the tips of the branches. The light broke through in patches, dappling the earth in shifting gold. And for a brief moment, he thought he saw something beyond the trunks. A movement. Too large to be deer. Too fluid to be human. A presence. Watching, then gone. He didn't chase it. He just nodded once and whispered, "Thank you." That night, he wrote nothing. Some memories weren't meant for paper, some rituals weren't for the record, and some silences were better left whole. Far off, deep in the trees, the sound returned. Not louder, but closer. And Daniel knew the answer wasn't in finding them. It was in being found. The wind came in low that morning, dragging a chill through the trees that didn't match the season. It had a different weight to it. Less like air moving and more like something shifting its place in the woods. Daniel had woken early, breath misting in the half-light, his hand resting instinctively on the notebook even before his eyes opened. It was the kind of day where something always changed, not with thunder, quietly, with a breath, with a scent, and he felt it in his bones before he saw a thing. He was finishing his second cup of bitter coffee boiled over the campfire when the first sign came. A sound that didn't belong. Not natural. Metal. A faint, sharp snap, like tension released. Not nearby, but not far either. A sound that didn't echo, just landed and stayed. His shoulders stiffened. He stood, turned his head, waited. Nothing. Then again, further east. Then silence. Daniel moved up the ridge, slow and silent, boots leaving no mark on the soft earth. The trees narrowed toward a bend, and when he came over the crest, he stopped. 3 men stood where the trail thinned out above the river cut, laughing low, half-wrapped in camo jackets too clean to belong in this part of the forest. One held a coil of thick steel trap. Another rested a heavy-bladed knife on his belt like a badge. The third was pacing, cigarette bobbing between his lips, blowing smoke toward the moss. They didn't look like hikers, and they weren't acting like men who respected the land. The laughter wasn't joyful. It was tight, loud, like they wanted to be heard, like they wanted something to hear them. Daniel ducked behind a cedar and watched. One of the men kicked at a stump, revealing the gleam of a baited snare already tucked beneath a dusting of leaves. Another dropped a black leather-bound field guide, turned to a page marked Sasquatch, Regional Myths. They laughed harder, not from disbelief, but from the thrill of cruelty. They weren't here to search. They were here to bait, to catch. Or worse. Daniel's throat dried. He felt the sick heat rise behind his ribs, that surge of panic and anger mixing in his gut like oil and spark. He crouched lower, pulled his bag tight, and began to move back down the slope. The forest pressed close around him. He didn't need to look to know. They were heading the same direction he'd been the day before, toward the gorge, toward the place he'd sworn not to return, toward the one who was too weak to move. He picked up speed, cutting across terrain he hadn't mapped, pushing branches aside, letting them whip against his sleeves. When he reached the lower ridge, Lydia was already there. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her face said everything. Her eyes had seen it too. The tension in her jaw, the way her fingers dug into the side of the walking stick she never used to lean on. She looked at him and blinked slowly, as if to say, "This is the part where you decide who you are." He nodded once, then he ran. Downhill, toward the fire pit, toward his tent, toward the notebook. He ripped open the flap, grabbed the satchel, pulled it close. His hands shook as he flipped past the early entries, past the ink-smeared pages from British Columbia, past the transcript of that one whisper in Oregon, past the notes from the girl in Weed who said she'd heard her forest mama hum her to sleep. He found the back section, the one marked in pencil, the one with the exact locations, the red-laced maps, the dates, the cross-references. Every instinct told him to save them. Every inch of his body screamed to preserve what he'd spent years assembling. But something deeper, something quieter, older, spoke above that now. This isn't about you anymore. It never was. He pulled the pages free, all of them. He knelt beside the fire circle, pulled out the lighter from his back pocket, the silver one with the tiny dent at the bottom, the one his father had carried through 2 deployments, the one Daniel had never once used for anything other than routine. He flicked it open, held the flame under the edge of the first page. It caught slow, then fast. Orange and black curling at the edges, the flames licking over coordinates and sketches and graphite-drawn paths of ancient retreat corridors. He dropped it onto the pile and fed more pages in. The smoke lifted fast, acrid, real. Then he began. With the end of a walking stick, he tapped the side of the trunk beside him. 3 slow knocks. Wait. 2 faster. Wait. 1 soft. Then silence. Then again. Not rhythm, pattern. He moved around the tree, knocked again, changed the tempo. It wasn't random. It wasn't music. It was memory. He mimicked the cadence he'd once heard as a child, half asleep in the roots of that old cedar in Olympic. The low thud that came before the lullaby. The kind of knock that wasn't a sound, but a message. I'm near. I'm listening. You're safe." He moved through the grove, tapping different trees, different trunks, letting the sound spread like a ripple through wood. Every knock was a thread pulled through the forest's cloth. He could feel it carry. He didn't know how, but he knew it. The men would hear it too. They would follow, toward sound, away from silence. The fire behind him caught harder now, the heat crawling toward his face. The last of the notebook's pages shriveled and curled, turning black in their death. The smoke rose thick, staining the canopy above like a funeral bell with no sound. Lydia appeared at the edge of the trees. She didn't speak, just watched. Then, when she saw what he was doing, she knelt beside the stone and added to the knock, her own rhythm, slower, heavier, deep and deliberate, like someone beating the earth's chest. The forest joined. Somewhere distant, a bird cried out, then fell silent. Far off, a twig snapped. Then 3 men cursed. A shout. Daniel didn't move. He struck the tree again, 3 times, then silence. The wind carried nothing but wood smoke now. No voices, no laughter. Just the forest, just the lullaby beneath the bark. When Lydia stepped closer, her fingers brushed his sleeve and lingered. No words, just touch. Daniel looked at her, and she nodded once. It was done. The pages were gone. The signal sent. The silence returned. But not empty. Not this time. And when Daniel looked up into the canopy, he saw nothing, but he felt everything. Something had heard, and something had changed a course. The forest that night was quieter than it had ever been. Not empty, not asleep, just held, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The breeze had died down after dusk, and even the river below Daniel's ridge flowed slower, softer, almost like it too was listening. There were no birds, no insects, no crackling twigs. The kind of quiet that made you forget you had a heartbeat, until you realized you were listening for it. Daniel didn't light a fire. He didn't need warmth, not in the way he thought. Something inside him was already burning in a different place. He moved through the dark like someone following the memory of a dream. Not by sight, not by path, just by something he couldn't explain. His breath was steady, hands loose by his sides, every step deliberate and light, as if too much weight might disturb whatever held this part of the woods together tonight. The stars were blocked by clouds, but the moon still found ways to slip through. Long silver shafts cutting between pine trunks and lighting patches of forest floor with a soft, almost sacred glow. It was enough to guide him. At the edge of a clearing, just before the ridge gave way to the gorge below, he stopped. The earth here was soft, thick with mulch and moss, the scent of cedar so strong it pressed into the skin. Daniel knelt. No words, no thoughts, just instinct. He laid both palms flat on the ground, not in prayer, not in desperation, in memory, like he had once done, though he couldn't say when. As a child, maybe. Or maybe it was older than that. Maybe it wasn't his memory alone. His fingers spread slightly, sinking into the cool, damp soil, and he closed his eyes. For a long moment, nothing. Just the silence. Just the feeling of being still enough for the earth to speak again. And then he felt it. Not heard, felt. A faint hum. Not beneath him, but through him. The kind that didn't vibrate the ground but your bones, like the beginning of a sound too deep to be named. He didn't open his eyes, just breathed slower. The forest had changed its breath again. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. Time didn't work the same when you were inside it like this, but something shifted. The air took on weight. A faint pressure on the back of his neck, like the moment before thunder, when you know the sky is about to speak. He opened his eyes, slowly, not lifting his hands. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, not close, just at the edge of the moonlight. A shape, still, immense, human and not. Hair long and matted with the dampness of the forest, shoulders wide and sloped with the gravity of age. Her arms hung by her sides, not tense, not threatening, and her face, shadowed by distance, by fur, by light that moved like water, but unmistakably there. The outline of high cheekbones, a brow, a jaw, lips. Amber eyes catching the moon like two mirrors holding fire. Daniel didn't move. He didn't need to. She saw him. She had always seen him. And for a moment, neither of them breathed. Then, she tilted her head. Just slightly. A gesture without violence, not questioning, not curious, recognizing, not you again, but you're still here. Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the lighter. It was old, brushed silver, scuffed along the sides. He turned it over in his palm once before setting it gently onto the forest floor in front of him. He didn't strike it, didn't spark it, just placed it down like it was never his to begin with. Like it had always belonged to this forest, to this place, to this moment. A gift. Not in trade, not as a plea, as thanks. He didn't look back up. He didn't need to. She hadn't moved. But he could feel her watching the flame that wasn't burning. Then Daniel leaned forward, slowly, forehead touching the moss between his hands. And he whispered without lifting his head, "Thank you." Not loud, not broken, just enough for the ground to hold. He stayed there, still, low, silent. Not because he was afraid, because it felt right. When he finally lifted his head again, she was gone. No rustle, no retreat, no crash of limbs through underbrush. Just absence, but not emptiness. The kind of absence that leaves an imprint, a warmth, a breath in the air that says, "I was here." He didn't stand. He just sat, hands resting on his knees, the lighter still on the ground between them, quiet and small under the dark sky. Around him, the forest began to move again. A single gust of wind stirred the canopy. Far off, a branch cracked. The river picked up pace, as though someone had released a pressure valve. He tilted his head to the side and listened. No sound, and yet everything inside him said, "She heard me. She saw me." And more than that, she accepted the offering. Not because she needed it, because he did. He stayed in that spot until the sky turned pale, the stars disappearing into the gray fabric of dawn. The lighter was gone, not disturbed, not misplaced. Gone. Daniel smiled, not from joy, but from knowing. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from the night air, and took one last look at the moss where he had knelt. Nothing marked the spot. No footprint, no scorch, no token. But he felt it inside him, like someone had threaded something soft and unbreakable through his chest and tied it to this place. He turned toward the trail but didn't take it yet. Something caught the corner of his vision, a shape deeper in the trees, a shadow. He paused, but it didn't move. He blinked, and it was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. Or maybe it always had. He took one step, then another, and the forest let him go. But not empty, not anymore. By the time the sun touched the tops of the pines, the moss was already warm underfoot, and the smoke from Daniel's last fire had thinned into nothing. He knelt one final time beside the fire pit and brushed his fingers through the blackened ashes just to feel their texture. Cold now, dry, silent. The lighter was gone, vanished in the same quiet way it had been accepted. No mark, no trace. Only the feeling in his chest that something had been received, something had been understood. And that had to be enough. He stood slowly and looked out toward the river, its surface rippling faintly under the morning breeze. Light poured through the branches in thin golden shafts that moved like curtains. No more tapping, no more signals, just the quiet dignity of the woods returning to their rhythm. That lullaby, the one that had once vibrated through his chest, the one he had chased all his life, had gone silent again. But not lost. He knew that now. It wasn't something to be captured. It was something you were lucky to hear once, if you were still enough, humble enough, human enough. Daniel packed without rushing. He folded his tarp with care, rolled his sleeping bag tight, tied every strap down like it mattered. When he hoisted the backpack onto his shoulders, it felt lighter than when he arrived. Not because it held less, but because he did. His boots moved down the slope one last time, tracing back through paths he hadn't marked, trusting the forest to guide him out as quietly as it had let him in. He didn't look back at the clearing. That wasn't his to keep. It never had been. But he carried it with him in his spine, in the hollow of his chest where questions had once rattled like loose change. They didn't anymore. The town was a day's walk. Maybe less if he didn't stop. But Daniel did stop. At a small rise near the trailhead where the trees began to thin and a patch of sunlight fell over the ridge like an invitation. There, in the dirt, not far from where he'd first pitched his tent, something waited. A new figure, smaller than the first. Woven again from reed and vine, but different now. Finer, more detailed, and unmistakable. 3 silhouettes just like before. But this time they weren't stiff or side by side like soldiers in a line. This time they leaned toward one another. The arms touched, the shapes curved in, and in the center of the smallest figure's chest, a single pine needle had been threaded through, still green. Daniel crouched, hands on his knees, eyes stinging from something too quiet to name. He didn't touch it, just looked. The reed was wet from dew. The shadows fell gently across its shape. And in that moment, he understood what he had never said out loud. It had never been about finding them. It had been about being remembered. And in some way, he had been. He turned and started down the hill. In the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drifted up from the service road near Eureka. Birds had returned to the trees overhead, chirping without rhythm. The forest was loosening its hold on him, giving him back to the world. He didn't resist. The town looked the same. A couple of gas stations, an old firehouse. The ranger outpost where he checked in under the pretense of beetles and tree rot. No one asked questions when he returned. No one seemed to expect answers. He walked past the bulletin board with its faded posters and outdated warnings and down the 2-lane road toward his truck. The dust on the windshield was thick, but the battery caught on the first try. The tires rolled slowly over the gravel, easing back onto the road as if the whole vehicle knew it shouldn't make a sound. Daniel drove in silence, windows halfway down, the scent of forest still clinging to the fabric of his clothes, his skin, his heart. He passed the school around noon, a small, mountain-grade elementary set at the edge of the trees. Faded paint, chain-link fence, a swing set rusting in one corner of the yard. And just beyond it, a figure caught his eye. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, standing by herself at the edge of the playground. Her shoes were muddy, and her shirt hung loose around her shoulders. She wasn't playing, wasn't running. She stood facing the woods, small hands pressed flat to her chest, her head tilted slightly as if listening. To what? Daniel didn't know, but the sight of her stilled him. He pulled over slowly, engine still running, heart tapping softly like a knock against wood. The girl didn't turn. She just stood there, so still it hurt, and closed her eyes for a second. Her fingers curled against her sternum, like she could feel something move beneath her ribs. Something too deep for language. Then she lowered her hands, opened her eyes, turned back to the others and walked away. Daniel watched until she disappeared around the corner of the building. Then he let out a breath and eased his foot off the brake. He didn't smile. Not quite, but something inside him softened. Because he knew, that sound, it hadn't stopped. It was just moving in a different way now. Not through pages, not through proof, but through people, through moments like that. Through gestures, silence, memory. He kept driving, past the ranger station, past the last gas pump, past the final curve where asphalt turned to gravel again. The road opened in front of him like it always had. But now, it no longer pulled. It simply carried. Behind him the forest stood as it always had, Thick, unmapped, unfinished, and alive. Not waiting to be understood, just waiting to be respected. Daniel didn't need to go back. He had never truly left. And somewhere, deep in the canopy, something walked between trees and fog and stone. Something massive, something ancient, something that once bled and hid and listened. It moved without sound, not to be seen, not to be chased, but to live, to remember, to sing its lullabies not with notes, but with knowing. And every now and then, it stopped, placed something small on the trail, something made from the hands of the forest, to remind whoever might pass through again. We are still here, we remember you, and we are listening. Sometimes the quietest things carry the loudest truths. A single stone placed gently on the earth. A sound you don't hear, but feel. A silence that isn't empty, but full of memory. There are places in this world untouched by roads, where no signal reaches, where time itself walks slower. And in those places, beneath the cedar canopy, along moss-covered trails, deep in river mist, some things still remember us. Not the version we present to the world. Not our names, our professions, or our past mistakes, but the part of us that is ancient, soft, honest. The part that listens more than it speaks. The part that shows up not to take, but to understand. In a world where so much noise is mistaken for meaning, maybe the most important things are passed down not in words, but in gestures, in patience, in presence. Maybe love is not always loud or visible. Maybe it is a rhythm passed from hand to hand, from shadow to soil, from heart to sky, asking nothing in return except that we honor it in silence. This story isn't about chasing mystery. It's about learning when to stop chasing, to stand still, to say thank you, even when no one answers. It's about the sacred act of remembering, and how remembering, when done with humility, becomes its own kind of prayer. One we carry forward in how we treat others, how we walk through the world, how we choose not to forget what matters most. Because the forest, like love, does not shout. It waits. It tests us with silence, and it trusts that, if we are listening closely enough, we will find our way back, not to where we were, but to who we are. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey with us. If the story moved you, we invite you to leave a comment below. Share where you're watching from, what you felt, what you carry with you now. And if you'd like to walk with us again, don't forget to subscribe and follow this channel. Every voice matters. Every listener belongs. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, may you always hear what the silence is trying to say.